So I just spent a week in LA talking with a bunch of filmmaking industry pros, and all over town I kept hearing the same thing again and again. The film industry is dead right now. From production company owners to DPs, everyone was worried, and it seems like everywhere I look, I'm seeing news articles about the production death spiral. And that definitely doesn't sound like good news for anyone trying to make a living with a camera, which includes me. So this video is going to be all about the current state of the industry and why things are stalled. Then I'll share my personal experiences and how I'm future-proofing myself, and ultimately we'll try and answer the question everyone is asking right now. Is it even possible to make a living in film in 2025 and beyond? So right now, according to a bunch of big news outlets like the LA Times and The Guardian, Hollywood is hurting. The LA Times article actually said there's been an almost 25% decline in total shoot days in the city, and that's backed up by the nonprofit organization Film LA.
A new report states filming in the greater LA area decreased 22% during the first quarter of this year.
Now don't worry, this video isn't about just what's happening in California. I mean, I'm Canadian. But for anyone who's making a living shooting video, these numbers are dramatic enough to pay attention to. After all, if the biggest film hub in the world is in a so-called death spiral, surely that's bad news for the rest of us, right? So let's quickly dive into what's happening and why, and then we'll get into what that means for you and what I'm personally expecting from my business moving forward. Oh, and speaking of moving forwards, my friends over at The Art of Documentary are opening their doors for a limited time, and they're giving viewers of this channel some pretty insane discounts, like up to 50%, plus the chance to win a full FX30 and cinema lens package, so hang around for a bit and I'll explain how that works later. Okay, so what's going on in LA and the broader mainstream Hollywood industry right now? Well, it's sort of a confluence of a bunch of things all at once. Of course, there were wildfires not that long ago, and that definitely stalled production, but I'm gonna set the disaster aside for now because it was kind of a random act of nature instead of a symptomatic issue with the film industry in general. It's terrible for sure, and I know multiple people in the business who lost their homes, but I don't think it factors all that much into executives' decisions about whether or not to greenlight a new project now that those fires are under control. No, what's really going on is more about algorithms and economics. And if we want to understand the slowdown, we need to understand a few things first. And firstly is the state of the entertainment market in general. Now, it's not really news anymore that there are fewer people going to the movies than there used to be, and that most people these days are getting their entertainment at home through streaming platforms. And if I'm honest, and as much as I still love the theater experience, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So right there, that means there's been a massive shift in market share away from the traditional movie studios and cinema chains and towards the tech companies like Netflix, who established themselves in the streaming world first. Because that's what Netflix is at heart, and a lot of those other streamers too. They're technology companies, which means they're trend-driven even more than Hollywood was and still is. They have so much data about who's watching and what they're watching and how long they're watching for, and that tells them so much about what kinds of shows are performing and why, which is an amazing asset for sure, and they'd be stupid not to plan around those numbers, but it also leads to creative stagnation. And here's what I mean by that. It's no secret that a ton of people are into true crime shows right now, and even though they're not really my thing, I do get the appeal. But what ends up happening in an algorithm-driven media world is that Netflix will have a meeting and see all the data that people are responding to true crime shows more than anything, and then they order more and more and more of it to try and satisfy demand, which makes sense, and I'd probably do the same if I were the VP production over there. At first, it's great as we get more shows that are similar to what we already like, but then gradually it kind of flips until there's so much of the same thing being churned out that it starts to seem like the whole landing page is filled with like mediocre crime stories that you can't really differentiate from each other anymore. The same thing happens if a celebrity doc like The Last Dance or a reality show like the F1 show does really well. Suddenly we have celebrity retrospectives by the dozen and a BTS series from every major sports league in the world. It's always sort of been like this, like when rom-coms did well, we'd see a bunch more, but these days it's gone into overdrive. From a strictly economic point of view, it does make sense, like I said, and an executive's job is to make money at the end of the day, not necessarily foster the arts. But this model is short-sighted in my opinion, and here's why. Let's think about some of the biggest hits out there right now, things like Severance or White Lotus or The Last of Us, or even going back to something like Game of Thrones. When those shows first came out, all of them were breakouts because they were really different and stood out from the rest. We really didn't know we wanted these shows at the time, but once they dropped, people just couldn't get enough. And then once those succeeded, then we got the inevitable follow-ups while every other platform rushed to churn out their own clone versions of these shows that are usually worse. In an increasingly algorithmic production world, though, that doesn't happen nearly as much because instead of taking a chance on something anything new. All the algorithm wants is more of the same, which means the chances of getting the next Game of Thrones gets less and less because there's no data to suggest it will succeed, so it never gets made. And that's the feedback loop we're in right now. Streamers spent billions smashing out content in the golden production years of pre-COVID, and then scaled their spending way back when it got out of control, and now they're all just kind of sitting back and playing it safe, cranking out the same formats again and again and again. If the algorithm says binge watching is more addictive than weekly releasing, then that's what we get. If the algorithm says women like true crime, it sees that as a sign that that's the only thing worth making. Pitches for shows that don't line up with that data are really hard to get greenlit, which ultimately means less and less is being shot as everything sort of concentrates around what the analytics suggest is going to perform well. On top of that, California has done a really good job of pricing itself out of the market. If you've ever tried to shoot anything in LA, you'll know that it's outrageously expensive. You need permits for literally everything, and the cost of even simple shoots has just ballooned to the point where smaller projects can't afford to make movies in Hollywood anymore. Instead, they go overseas to places like Hungary where labor costs are lower, and that creates a world where it's cheaper to fly 100 people to Ireland and then put them all in hotels than it is to film locally. And while I know that Trump has just placed some tariffs on foreign films to hopefully reignite the movie industry, I'm not really convinced that that approach will work, and that's probably such a complex topic that we'll save it for another video. And while not being able to afford to shoot locally is obviously a massive challenge, and if Hollywood wants to stay competitive, it's going to need to address that soon, but the issue is more systemic than that. What we've been witnessing the last 5 years or so has been the steady decline of the filmmaking middle class. And when I say filmmaking middle class, I'm talking about all those people who carved out great careers for themselves shooting things like broadcast TV commercials and low-budget features and network television shows. Now, there's no exact way to define who falls into this category, but to be painfully obvious, it's everything that isn't the high end or the low end. So it's not quite premium level, but bigger than indie or run and gun. And it used to be that this was where a lot of film professionals made their living. They started out doing small-scale stuff and then worked their way up to a network series, and then they could kind of find work in that space for decades. Some people would push a little harder and join the traveling circus that is big budget movie making, or maybe some would veer off into docs or some scrappier types of production, but most people could find a home in the middle. From what we can see now, though, that all seems to be ending. As Patrick O'Sullivan, aka the Wandering DP, told me recently, as someone who built his whole career around that middle class world, he tells young cinematographers that it's no longer really possible to have the career that he does.
The middle jobs in the industry have sort of disappeared. Those jobs are gone. I live in this middle range. I would call it like the middle class of cinematography. I do commercials, and to do the commercials and to take advantage of my skills, you have to have like a small-ish crew, 2 in lighting, 2 in grip, 2 in camera. And I come and we sort of get the maximum juice from the squeeze that we possibly can in that time. That's gone. Like that is completely gone. You couldn't start a career and then get there because those jobs have dwindled incredibly quickly.
So does that mean the dream of becoming a professional filmmaker is dead? No, definitely not. It's going to be different, but if you're ready for it, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Because in the age of the internet, when everyone is in front of a screen all the time, the content taps have been turned on, and they're just not going to get shut off anytime soon. People want good stuff to watch, and they're mostly willing to pay for it. They just don't want the same things they used to, and the industry has to adapt. Like, almost no one sits down on their couch these days to turn on NBC to see what generic sitcom or CSI spinoff is on offer that night. And unless you're in a doctor's office or an airport, you're probably not sitting through many traditional commercial breaks either. Now, if you're like most people, you're either watching some big budget production on a major streaming platform like Netflix or Hulu or whatever, or else you're on a social media platform like YouTube. Obviously, that's a problem for the tens of thousands of people who made a living making that stuff that nobody really seems to want to watch anymore. So doesn't that mean we're all doomed? No, but you have to be realistic about where the industry is going and where the opportunities will be. And from what I can see, that means either working as hard as you can to get into the world of the very high-end productions, or figure out how to do more with less and grab the opportunities that are popping up everywhere on the lower end of things. And let me just be clear, when I say lower end or lower budget, it might make you think that I'm saying it doesn't pay well, but that's not it at all. Because these days you can do a ton more than you used to be able to, like a lot more with a lot less than ever before. And just because something isn't mega high budget doesn't mean it can't be extremely high quality and just as profitable, if not more so, which we'll get into soon. Because the truth is that while yes, there used to be a lot more jobs for grips and makeup artists and electricians on those middle class sets, those budgets were honestly bigger than they needed to be to meet the demands of a lot of today's markets. But if you can be nimble and you have the right skills to deliver high-quality, story-driven content with a small team, there are so many opportunities floating around these days that never existed 15 years ago. And if you're watching this and thinking, sure, that sounds great, but I don't know how to make those kinds of scrappier style projects, then this is a perfect time to talk about the art of documentary. If you like this channel, you've probably already heard of it, but just in case you haven't, Art of Documentary is an online film school with a community of over 7,500 filmmakers now that offers premium courses on every aspect of the doc filmmaking process. And for whoever's out there gasping in shock right now, but Luke, don't you sell your own filmmaking course? How can you do a sponsored video with AOD? Let's just all calm down here because they're very different things, and the simple answer is that I can recommend AOD because we're just not competitors. My course is very focused on one thing, which is how to shoot high-end verite cinematography, because that's what I know and that's what I do professionally. AOD is different, and the 5 modules cover everything from the foundational principles of documentary storytelling through to editing and even how to grow your creative business. One of the biggest reasons I feel so good about working with them, though, is that they focus on the stuff that really matters, not gimmicky tricks that you can get on YouTube for free. It's about finding stories and 3-dimensional characters and making films that have an impact, and that's the kind of knowledge that actually helps people develop film careers in the modern market. All the modules are great in different ways, but in the context of this video, the most relevant is probably Create and Earn. It's perfect for people who've got the foundations already but want to start growing the commercial arm of their business and find paying clients, so you can ignore what's happening in Hollywood and do your own thing. And for the rest of this week, all their courses are up to 40% off, but then to sweeten the deal even more, if you use the link in the description and enter the code Luke10, you can save another 10% on top of that, so 50% total savings. They're also giving away a full Sony FX30 kit with some really cool lightweight cinema lenses, so check out the link below, learn the skills that will help you navigate this crazy time in the film industry, save a bunch of cash, and maybe even win a full shooting setup too. Great deal for everyone. But even as I say all this stuff, I know there are a lot of people out there who like things the way they are and don't want to stop working those middle-class film jobs. If I'd been working like that for 15 years and then suddenly the bottom dropped out of the market, I'd hate it too. There's nothing wrong with people enjoying that kind of work and fighting for it to stick around. But the reality, at least as far as I see the trends going, is that it's a bit of a losing battle and the industry is going to keep going the way it is for now, which again means away from the middle. For a lot of people, that really sucks, and I get it. But the thing is, working in the arts has always been ruthless like that. And if you want the benefits of that creative work environment, you kind of have to adapt to what the market wants if you want to survive. I mean, I've already had to completely transition careers because of market trends multiple times before, and I'm fully expecting to have to stay just as flexible moving forwards. Like when I first started working with cameras, it was as a photojournalist, not a cinematographer. If you don't know, I used to live in Asia for almost 10 years where I shot editorial assignments for international newspapers like the New York Times and Al Jazeera, and it was my biggest life dream to be one of those international photographers who traveled the world covering global events. But then the industry changed and the model moved away from parachuting in foreign correspondents to world hotspots towards hiring more local talent so they could tell their own stories. And I'm in full support of that shift. Like, why would you send a random Canadian guy to, I don't know, the Philippines to shoot something when there are incredible Filipino photographers on the ground already who speak the language and know the issues better than I ever could. Plus, it's cheaper, and never forget that media is a business at the end of the day, not a privilege. But as much as I think things like that are pretty positive developments, it still meant that the days of the Don McCullen-style globetrotting photojournalists were over outside of a tiny handful of famous names. So I looked at the state of things, and even though I didn't really like what I saw, I accepted it and taught myself video so I could eventually transition into cinematography, where I am today. And don't get me wrong, I love what I'm doing now. But if I had my choice, I think I'd still be a photojournalist. At the same time, I think if I was still only doing photojournalism right now, I'd be in a pretty tough spot financially and would kind of be constantly stressed trying to make things work in hyper-expensive Canada or hyper-expensive world these days. So it was the right choice, totally. So the frustration that a lot of industry vets must be feeling right now does hit close to home for me, and I have a ton of empathy. No one wants to be forced to pivot late in their career, but sadly that choice isn't really something we can control. But with all that said, I don't see this shift as a bad thing necessarily, but only if you're positioned right or ready to pivot. So what do I mean by that? I think the fundamental question right now is whether or not there is going to be a demand for high quality visual content moving forwards. In my opinion, that's a resounding yes, because people are consuming more and more all the time, and I just don't see those content tabs shutting off anytime soon, like I said. At the same time, we've already established that trends are shifting and that people are watching different kinds of things in different places than they used to, leading to the decline of the filmmaking middle class. So if both of those things are true at the same time, that means that the future market demand is likely going to be for people working at the high end or the low end of the industry, like I said. And for me personally, that's been a great thing because I have a toe in both of those markets, and it's totally possible to do the same thing. See, because I'm self-taught and I never went to film school, and because I only ever wanted to shoot documentary photos and video, and because I lived overseas, I never really saw those middle-class jobs as an option. Like when I was living in Cambodia and shooting my first short films, I wasn't doing it because I thought I'd be able to get a union gig on a sitcom or something down the road. So I just kind of kept doing my own thing well outside the mainstream industry, shooting shorts for NGOs or news outlets. And then over the years, I built up a reputation for being a person who could go pretty much anywhere and come back with a decent story. Later, when I moved to Mexico and set up shop as a full-time doc DP, I started a very intentional networking campaign to promote myself pretty much exclusively to the highest end doc production companies I could find. I went to New York multiple times a year, and I always introduced myself as a cinematographer, not a journalist or videographer. And you know what? After a year or so of doing that and a couple lucky breaks, the gigs started to come in. Now, in a lot of ways, I was quite lucky because I started my career in the pre-pandemic production boom where every streamer was tripping over itself to get as many high-quality docs as possible. For years, I was just booked solid, sometimes traveling up to 200 days a year, and all of it was on the high end for things like Netflix and HBO and Showtime, etc. And honestly, while it lasted, it was incredible. I made tons of cash and I stacked up a lot of high-profile clients on my resume, and it was really exciting in a time that I'll be forever grateful that I lived through. But then, as we all know, the boom kind of ended. Streamers cut way back, and it's much harder to get a premium doc made now than it was 7 years ago by a long shot. So in 2025, I'm probably shooting 2 to 3 large projects a year instead of maybe 8 to 10, which should be a disaster, except for the fact that I'm doing better than ever. And that's because even though I got used to working on some pretty big budget things, I never really let go of my scrappy roots. Because I never came through those union sets where everything's really regimented and done a very specific way, I didn't really care that much when things started to change. Instead, I leveraged my track record of making high-end docs to start attracting different kinds of clients who valued that sort of thing, even if they didn't have $5 million to travel to Papua New Guinea or somewhere. Often that means working with much smaller production companies or commercial agencies who might not have the prestige of Netflix, but might actually be able to pay me or you a lot more at the end of the day. So let's get into some specific examples because that probably sounds a bit too good to be true. So last year, one of my biggest jobs was from Coinbase, that huge crypto exchange, if you don't know what I'm talking about. And they wanted me to document a cross-country music tour they were staging. Now, Coinbase has really deep pockets and probably could have hired any commercial team in the world if they'd wanted, but they didn't want a fleet of trucks and a huge crew following them around. They wanted a small, nimble team that didn't need too much gear, but could still deliver really high-end doc-style content. And for a full-time doc DP like me, that's a pretty standard work environment, so they offered me the gig even though I don't have a single piece of commercial work on my website. We didn't need even a fraction of the resources that traditional middle-class commercial crew would have used, and in my opinion, we still gave them some truly amazing stuff while only having 4 duffel bags of equipment. And you know what? That was my most profitable job of the year, even though it wasn't nearly as elaborate as some of the Netflix docs I used to shoot. Actually, the day rate ended up being literally 3 times higher than what I got for my first 3 gigs that ended up on Netflix. By a lot of traditional metrics, when it comes to gear and crew size, that campaign was a very low-end job. And if I'd rolled up to a big commercial set with an FX9 and a couple of backpacks, I would have been laughed out of the room. Joke's on them though, because I got paid just as well, if not better, than I did shooting the high-profile stuff. And I still do the high-profile stuff. I'm here right now in the middle of a 7-week shoot, so I'm not saying everyone should quit the industry and go do tiny run-and-gun productions. I'm just saying if you have a track record in one and you can get your foot in the other using that reputation, there is a ton of opportunity out there. And I get it. Coinbase is a huge company, and not everyone is getting offered those gigs every every day. And I didn't either for a very long time. I've just been doing this for more than a decade now. It's not like you can snap your fingers and suddenly get huge clients. It takes time and commitment and a ton of hustle. But there are a lot of businesses and organizations out there who are in need of high quality content without the bloated production budgets of the past. And if you can do that and find a way to get on their radar, they'll pay you a lot, but you only get those gigs if you build up a reputation first as someone who can deliver high-end work. All that is to say that if I was starting again right now, I would do whatever I could to skip the middle-class world entirely and then straddle the high-end and low-end at the same time. Start out with a scrappy mindset and take whatever entry-level gigs you can scrounge up and learn to get better and hopefully pay your bills. Then you work as hard as you possibly can to get onto some big budget or at least well-known projects so that you can get a reputation for higher-end work. Then use those gigs to impress the lower-end clients who are desperate for their projects to look world-class, and I think you'll find that you're going to be just fine financially in the long run. This is all obviously easier said than done, but that doesn't mean it's wrong, even though I'm sure some people will disagree very strongly in the comments. And as I look into the future, I'm pretty confident that these trends are going to keep going. And once again, I totally understand why people are upset about these developments, but the thing is, the industry doesn't care what you want. Just because you've gotten used to things being a certain way doesn't mean it's going to stay that way, and no matter how mad you get at the changing market, it won't make a difference. It's harsh, but true. Otherwise, I'd still be shooting stills with a 35mm lens. No, the real question is, would you rather pivot or quit and do something else because you can't survive? There's no right choice there because some people truly would rather quit than change, but for the rest of us, including me, if you're willing to embrace the new reality and leverage your high-end skills for the low-end market, I think there's a ton of opportunity out there, like a huge amount of it. And since I'm personally busier than ever, I'm just going to ignore all the news about this death spiral from here on out and get back to work. See ya.